Hello everyone, today we're going to look at the fine-tuning argument, and I'm going to explain why it is not a very good argument for the existence of God. To start with, before we get into the fine-tuning argument, we need to understand the standard model of fundamental physics, at least in general terms. This diagram here explains the general outline. We don't need all the details here. The important point to understand is that standard model consists of a number of particles, such as quarks, neutrinos, and electrons, summarized in the middle here, as well as the different fields of force that mediate the interactions between them, such as gluons, W bosons, and the photon. Now, in addition to these particles and the forces that mediate between them, the standard model also consists of a number of equations that describe their interactions with each other. And in order for these equations to be accurately predictive of phenomena in the real world, they need to have a number of constants inserted into them. And these constants have empirically determined values that need to be measured. We don't know what these values will be until we actually conduct the measurement. This table here summarizes 26 of these fundamental constants, most of which describe the masses of different particles as well as the strength of certain interactions. And there are also 5 constants that relate to cosmological properties that are outside the standard model included at the bottom. And these are taken from a paper which discusses fine-tuning in a physical context. The important point is that, as I've mentioned, we don't really know what the values of any of these constants will be until we actually measure them. And so the values could theoretically be anything, at least across a very wide range. And this fact has led to investigations as to what range of parameters would allow the development and emergence of life in our universe. And when we talk about life, as we'll see later, typically the focus is on life in a stable solar system on a rocky planet with sufficient conditions for the development of complex chemistry, particularly carbon-based chemistry. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but that's typically what physicists are looking for. And what they do is they construct these diagrams. I've shown 2 here for illustration. Now, don't worry too much about the details of these. Each of them describes the range of parameters across which it would be possible for the existence of life to emerge. In particular, the left-hand diagram relates to star formation, and the right-hand diagram relates to the potential masses of different fundamental particles and which of them would allow the existence of life. The important point is that most combinations of parameters would not allow the existence of life, at least life as we know it. Only these fairly small regions at the center here would permit the existence of life. And it's important to also note that these graphs are logarithmic, so in fact the relative proportion of the area shown here is tiny compared to the area of the rest of the diagram. And this observation of physicists that apparently the number of ways that the constants could be is vastly more than the number of ways that they could be that permit the existence of life has led to the development of what we call the fine-tuning argument. So the fine-tuning argument goes something like this. The probability of these combinations of life-allowing values of the constants, conditional on naturalism, and by naturalism here we just mean the laws of physics operating as we know them and nothing sort of outside of that. The probability of life-permitting values of the constants given naturalism is very low. Conversely, the probability of life-permitting values of the constants given theism, and here by theism I just mean the existence of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. We'll talk more about the details in a moment. So the probability of life-permitting constants given theism is not very low. Proponents of this argument don't necessarily say that it has to be high under theism, just that it's much, much higher than it is under naturalism, and that's why here I say not very low. Now, taken together, these 2 propositions lead to the conclusion that the probability of life-permitting constants given theism is much, much bigger than the probability of life-permitting constants under naturalism. And hence, this observation here, the observation that the constants are life-permitting, is strong evidence for theism over naturalism. So, I think there are a number of problems with this argument, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. First, let's talk about problems with the first premise, that the probability of life-permitting constants given naturalism is very low. The first problem I identify with this premise is what I call the fixation on constants, the physical constants of the theory. The issue here is that these constants have no meaning or significance or interpretation at all outside of a specific physical theory, a set of equations describing the interactions. We, in fact, have no idea or very little idea what the universe would be like if the fundamental laws were different. To illustrate this point, I've shown here a summary of what's called the Lagrangian, which basically is the equation describing the interactions between different fields and particles in the standard model. And this form here illustrates the relationship between the matter fields, like electrons, energy fields, like the photon, and the Higgs field, which gives mass to the electron and other particles. The important point here is that it's the precise form of these equations which dictates the physical content of the theory, and only in the context of these specific equations do the physical constants, the values of the constants, have any meaning. If you put the constants in any other context, or for that matter change the equations, then the physical constants don't really have the same meaning anymore, or can't really be interpreted. And because of this, in my view, it's quite silly to focus only on the constants, because the constants go together with the equation to define the physical content of the theory. It's really artificial to separate them, and indeed the only reason why they are typically separated in the fine-tuning argument is because it's much easier to make predictions about what would happen if you only consider different values of the constants compared to if you try to think about different physical theories, of which there's a huge number, and it's very hard to even think about what the different possibilities are. To illustrate the point I'm making here, imagine that we have a bunch of data that we've collected, which are the dots here, and then we fit a few different curves through that data with slightly different functional forms, as you can see with the equations here. Now, we could fit those curves and then estimate the values of the coefficients in those curves. And then we could imagine what would happen if we varied those coefficients, if we shifted up the c value of the y-axis intercept, for example, while keeping the equation, the form of the equation, the same. But the problem with doing that is that it doesn't really make any sense to keep the equation the same but then change the coefficients. The coefficients don't have any meaning outside of fitting that particular functional form to that particular set of data. In other words, if you're going to change the coefficients, you also need to consider changing the form of the equation that the coefficients describe. The two go together in describing the data, just like the constants and the equations in the standard model go together in describing the physical universe, and they can't meaningfully be separated. I mean, we can kind of conceptually separate them, but in terms of whether imagining some of them being different while keeping the others the same really tells us much about the ways that the universe could be, I think is really quite suspicious. They go together, and I don't think separating like this really makes any sense. And indeed, proponent of the fine-tuning argument, Luke Barnes, has made a similar point to this when talking about the fact that the equations of the universe, of the standard model, could well be different, at least as far as we know, right? He says, quote, "The principle of least action is not a necessary truth. The Lagrangian formalism itself is not forced upon us a priori. There are plenty of other mathematical structures and systems lurking in the set of all possible worlds," end quote. And, you know, if this is true, if we should consider the different possible equations and relationships alongside the variation of constants, then I think that the fine-tuning argument is in quite a lot of trouble, because the fine-tuning argument doesn't say anything about what would happen if we changed the equations, only the constants. Okay, let's look at the second problem with the first premise, that the probability of finding life-permitting constants under naturalism is very low. And this is what I call the argument from ignorance, or in other words, the whole argument is an argument from ignorance. So physicists have found that life as we know it, organic life living on rocky worlds or surrounding fairly old main-type stars, would probably be impossible if the constants were a little bit different, even slightly different, relative to the range of possibilities. They infer from this that any type of embodied life would also be impossible, or likely impossible, if the constants were even a little bit different. But the problem with this is that it is a blatant appeal to ignorance. We don't actually know what conditions life could exist in. We're making a blind assumption that, well, we don't know how life could exist if the constants were different. We know that our types of life couldn't exist, but therefore we'll just sort of assume that no type of life could exist. If you look at these sorts of articles and presentations of this, there's typically all sorts of assumptions made. Even if they don't explicitly assume carbon-based life, there's still assumptions, for example, that life would require billions of years to develop, or that life requires bound states of fundamental particles, like atoms. Indeed, there's an assumption that life requires matter at all. I argue that we don't know whether any of these are true. We know that they're true in our universe with our forms of life, but what if the universe was very different and had different constants? Would any of these things be true? What's so special about billions of years or bound states in terms of the relevance that they have to the existence of life? Other types of life might be able to evolve much, much more quickly if they rely on processes that occur more quickly than chemical evolution. Likewise, what's so special about bound states? Really, all you need, it seems to me, is sufficiently complex interactions between different particles. If those types of interactions are complex enough in the right environment and with energy input, then it seems to me that there's no in principle impossibility about the emergence of life. It's just that we don't know enough about the relevant systems, and indeed we wouldn't really expect to know because we're talking about a different universe with different physical constants. Just to give an illustration to demonstrate what I'm talking about, one example of how little we know about the relevant factors here is if we look at the actual content of the universe, the energy content of the universe as far as we know it. This diagram here illustrates that about 20% of the universe consists of dark matter, which are massive particles that don't interact very much and seem to have an effect on, say, galaxy formation and rotation, but we don't really know what it is or what it does. Even worse is dark energy, which forms over 70% of the energy content of the universe and appears to be involved in accelerating the expansion of the universe over time. But once again, we don't really have a clue what this dark energy is or how it relates to the rest of the matter and energy that we know about in the standard model. So in this situation where we only even understand about 5% of the energy content of the universe in terms of what it is or how it interacts, are we really in a position to say what conditions life would need in a different universe with different sets of physical constants, especially when we start considering varying many of those constants at once and not just one or two as most studies do. The more constants you vary, the more different behavior may emerge that we can't even conceive of now or understand the consequences of that behavior. And another good illustration of this, relating to what I was saying about predicting the consequences of different constants, is the Hartree-Fock-Ruthan-Hall equations that I'm showing on the side here at the bottom. Now, forgive me for showing yet more complex equations. The point of these is that these are the equations that are used to predict the structure and properties of multi-electron atoms and also usually fairly small molecules. What's interesting is that even the smallest atom, or second smallest atom after hydrogen, helium with 2 electrons, is computationally infeasible to determine its properties and structure without complex computational methods and the equations that I show here. The point I'm making here is that if you just had the equations of the standard model and the constants, you still wouldn't be able to predict the different forms of chemistry that would emerge without doing considerably extra computational work and involving quite a lot of approximations and many decades of development. And that's when we're starting from a point of already knowing a lot about chemistry. The idea that physicists can just look at the forms of their equations and then make some simulations or predictions based on very basic processes that exist in our universe and then somehow know what all of the consequences would be in a different universe with different constants is really quite laughable to me. I don't believe that physicists have this ability or have demonstrated that they know how to do this. And the fact that we can't even predict the structure and properties of very basic chemical elements using the tools of fundamental physics, you need additional tools from computational chemistry in there as well, illustrates to me that we don't in fact know very much about what conditions life could exist in a different universe. So those are the two arguments that I wanted to advance in opposition to the first premise that the probability of a life-permitting universe given naturalism is very low. Now I want to move on to the second premise, that the probability of life-permitting constants under theism is not very low. And here I think that the major issue can be summarized under the broad umbrella of the problem of divine psychology. And so I'll explain a fair bit about this over the next few minutes. So the fundamental issue here is that given only the proposition that God exists and created the universe, we have no reason to think that God would favor one type of universe over any other type of universe, as long as they're consistent with his omnipotence and omnibenevolence. But absent further content, we don't really know specifically what God would want to create. Now, the apologist answer to this is, as I'm about to argue, to apply double standards, different standards to theism versus naturalism, and also exercise a convenient lack of imagination about the different ways God could possibly have done things. And this is critical because if you're going to make a claim about the probability that God would do one thing instead of something else, you need to have some basis of a claim about what the range of possibilities is that God could do and why it is that he selects a subset of those. And apologists, in my experience, have an amazing lack of imagination and a lack of interest in this question, despite it being essential to the argument that they make. So specifically, with respect to double standards, Apologists use a different method for estimating the probability that God would create a life-sustaining universe than they do to estimating the probability that such a universe would arise through natural causes. We'll see more about this in a moment. As for the lack of imagination point, as I've just said, they fail to think about the ways God could have done things differently other than the way he actually did, which is essential to making the argument that they want to make. And so it all comes down here to the fact that we don't know, absent further assumptions, which I'll get to in a moment, what God would want to do, and therefore the argument that appeals to God's desires or reasons or motivations can't really go forward. Let's dig down into this with a little bit more depth. So let's talk about the double standards issue. To illustrate this, I've taken two quotes from the same author, who is a proponent of the fine-tuning argument, illustrating the standards as they are typically established for naturalists when they're attempting to explain fine-tuning, and comparing that to the standards that theists and apologists set for themselves when they're making appeals and trying to explain fine-tuning by appealing to God. So the quote here relating to naturalism refers to the multiverse hypothesis, which I'm not going to talk about too much, but essentially is the idea that we can explain by how the universe permits the existence of complex life through natural forces by appealing to a multiverse of many, many universes, each of which has slightly different values of the constants. We find ourselves living in one of those rare universes that has the set of constants necessary for life. So this is the proposal that's being referred to here. Quote, for a multiverse proposal to make predictions, it must be able to calculate and justify a measure over the set of universes it creates. The predictions of the inflationary multiverse are very sensitive to this measure, and thus, in the absence of such a measure, we cannot conclude that it survives the test of the principle of mediocrity. End quote. So what's being said here is that in order for naturalists to appeal to a multiverse, in order to explain anything about, why we see the universes that we do, we need to have a particular measure, which is a way of defining the probabilities of different types of universes or the properties of the multiverse. And absent this measure, then we can't really say anything about what the probability of different universes would be under a multiverse because we don't have any way of assigning probabilities to those different universes. So that's the standards that are set for naturalism. Now let's compare what the same author has to say about the standards for theism. Quote, a moral universe needs moral agents, that is creatures with free will, who can recognize and appreciate good things, do good actions, interact with influence and be responsible for each other, investigate their surroundings, and learn the goodness of beauty, love, knowledge, and truth. A universe capable of producing and sustaining such creatures is a universe with moral worth, one that God might create. End quote. Now observe here that this is a justification for why God might create a universe with life in it, or a universe suitable for the existence of life, and it consists of, in my opinion, very vague, hand-wavy statements about platitudes like beauty and love and taking responsibility and things like that, which we'll look at a bit more in a moment. But the point is that gone is any idea that we have to provide a rigorous predictions or probability measures over these different possible universes or say anything very specific about what God wants. We can just sort of make vague gestures to generic type statements about things that maybe God would want to do. And to me, this is a blatant double standard. If the naturalist has to provide specific predictions and probability measures over the different possible universes that they are appealing to when they talk about a multiverse, surely the theist should be held to the same standard and they should have to provide specific predictions and probability measures over the different range of possible universes or features of a universe that God would want to create. And of course, but theists and apologists never do this. They only make these sorts of vague general statements. And when naturalists attempt to make vague general statements in response, they're told that they're just speculating or their theories are not scientifically testable. Well, I think that this is a blatant double standard and a major problem for theistic defenses of the fine-tuning argument. Now, let's talk about the second problem, lack of imagination. So I'll go through a few illustrations of how theists who defend this argument lack imagination about God's motivations. And so this is the same quote that I just showed you before, but I've underlined a few key points that I think are subject to at least quite a bit of debate or question. And the question here is, why would God create a universe with life in it? Why is that something that we would expect a benevolent God to do? We're told that, well, it's good to have moral agents who can be responsible for each other and appreciate goodness and so forth. But is it though? Is that really what we'd expect God to create? I mean, there's lots of other potential, at least hypothetical things that might be good or that we might think a good God would create. is it really that expected that we would have a universe with moral agents with free will who can investigate their surroundings and so forth? Why are these things especially important? We're not really given a theory here about moral goodness and what the range of possibilities is under God. To just illustrate a few things that come to mind, why not just God by himself? It seems to me that God is supposed to be all perfect and entirely self-sufficient. God doesn't need to create anything to make the universe better. It's not like there's something lacking in the universe that God needs to add in addition to himself. God is God, right? He's entirely self-sufficient and magnificent, perfect, all by himself. Thank you very much. Why would he create anything beyond himself? So it seems to me that the strongest prediction you would have if God did exist is that he wouldn't create anything. He would simply bask in his own awesomeness. But even if you did expect him to create something, well, why not just create beautiful things in nature? I'm not exactly sure what God would find beautiful or is objectively beautiful under God or whatever, but maybe planets, black holes, a whole universe of gardens and lakes, rivers, a really, really long Great Barrier Reef. I mean, I don't know. This is the point. We don't really have a clue what God would want to create because we don't have a theory about what a good God would want to do because of the problem of divine psychology. What about plants and animals? So when I've been talking about life, I've implicitly, although not really being clear about this, been talking about intelligent life, so of the sort that humans have. And this is sort of also clear from the sorts of defenses you see theists make where they talk about moral agency. So the question is, why is that so valuable? Why not just have a universe of plants and animals living in harmony with each other and enjoying a good life or fulfilling their functions and purposes? Why does moral agency add something to that? The ability to hurt other people in a devious way. It's not obvious. Of course, there's things one could say, but again, what is the probability of a particular outcome that God would create relative to all of the other possibilities? How do we provide a measure over that? What about pure blissful experience? Why doesn't God just create experience of awesome worshipfulness towards him, or of pure ecstasy, or of pure satisfaction, or whatever? Again, depending on what you think is morally valuable. Things we can't even imagine. It seems to me that there's likely many other things that, we probably can't even think of. Hindu cosmology is an interesting source of many different realms and beings and types of interactions that I think are an interesting source to look into for stoking one's imagination about different possibilities. The point I want to make here is simply that theists have very little to say about this and just sort of tell us that, well, you would expect a God to make moral agents, and that's why we would expect God to make a universe that can have life in it. But there's not really a theory here as to why or what the probability distribution is over different possibilities, of which, as I try to illustrate here, there are very, very many. So let's continue this lack of imagination argument and talk about why does life specifically have to be embodied? So here's a quote from Swinburne here talking about this. Quote, "There is a particular kind of goodness in human persons which bodies in a law-governed universe. With a body we have a limited chink of matter under our control, and if we so choose, we can choose to learn how the world works, and so learn which bodily actions will have more remote effects. Thereby God allows us to share in his creative activity of choosing." End quote. So once again, what we see is these sorts of vague gestures to some maybe psychologically plausible kind of intuitive reasons as to why perhaps we might think God would create an embodied universe. So, we can learn how the world works because there's actions and reactions in the physical universe, and we can share in his creative activity. But really, this is just hand-waving. Like, why is it good for us to share in God's creative activity? Doesn't he have that all kind of down by himself? And why does he want us to participate in that? Why is it good for us to have a limited chink of matter under our control? I actually think that might be a typo. I think it's chunk of matter. But anyway, either way, why is it that important? Couldn't we have interaction between persons in a simulation, like a simulated world, which would not mean that we're embodied? What about telepathy, direct mind-to-mind communication? You can still have relationships there. What about disembodied agents, such as angels are supposed to be, or for that matter, God himself? I mean, God doesn't have a body, so why is it so important that he creates intelligences that have bodies? There's an obvious, I think, incongruence there. There's a very interesting paper called Electrons in Love, which talks about how God could create electrons or some other very simple physical particles or entities, which nevertheless had sophisticated minds. After all, he's God. There's no logical contradiction there, so that would be possible for God. And so then why would we expect that God would need a universe with constants that allow for the existence of very complex biomolecular machines in order to have embodied life? It seems that God could get embodied life without any of those things. So why bother? What's the point? Why would you expect that? And once again, we have to consider things we can't even imagine or we haven't thought of yet. So once again, there seems to be very little effort on the part of theists to explain why we would expect God to want to create embodied life specifically, and no real effort to provide any kind of probability distribution over the range of different types of life that God might be likely to create. Let's consider now the final instance of lack of imagination, or the final one I'll talk about at least, which is, why is it that if God is going to create embodied life that he needs to do so, or he would do so in a universe with laws that permit the existence of that life? After all, God isn't bound by physical laws, he can do what he wants. So why is it that there needs to be physical laws that permit the existence of life instead of God just making life anyway, regardless of what the laws would say? So here's what Luke Barnes has to say about this. Quote, "On theism, the laws of nature just are a description of how God runs the universe. So it makes no sense to say that God would make a consistent exception to the laws of nature. Further, it seems a bit thoughtless for God to make any old universe and then have to constantly poke it to make it life-permitting. A universe with the right laws in the first place is simpler and easier to investigate scientifically." End quote. We see here a common thread that there's sort of these vague references to things that maybe sound sort of intuitively plausible in the face of it, but if you think about them, don't really explain anything or don't really give us any detail about why this is what God would expect. So for a start, it would seem that this paragraph here is stating that God isn't in the business of doing miracles because he just sets up the universe in a certain way and then lets it run without poking it, so to speak. And this seems inconsistent with at least what many proponents of the fine-tuning argument would otherwise want to say, so that is, I think, an open issue there. But also, there's a problem because the laws of nature, as described by, say, the standard model, may well not be the final ultimate laws. In fact, we know that they're not because there are many phenomena that aren't described by the standard model. But even aside from that, there could be other regularities in nature or regularities as a result of God's interventions that are not captured by those standard laws, but we simply haven't been able to measure them or detect them. Indeed, this seems necessary. If God does interact with the universe, then those fundamental laws won't always be the true, so to speak, descriptions of the way nature works. There may be more fundamental, more ultimate laws that we just don't know about or aren't described by that type of physics. So just saying, well, the laws are a description of how God runs the universe, and so it wouldn't make sense for God to have consistent exceptions. That's just not true. It's perfectly possible for God to create a universe in which life exists, and yet life does not exist in virtue of the fundamental laws of that universe. It simply exists anyway in virtue of other, more ultimate laws which aren't described at the level of fundamental physics. So this, I think, would be potentially an example of what's sometimes called strong emergence, or it could just be a miracle. Maybe they're the same thing, I'm not sure. But the point is, it's just wrong to say that, well, laws of nature are just descriptions of how things work, and so he couldn't make consistent exceptions. Of course he could, because the laws of nature as described by fundamental particle physics aren't necessarily everything about a full description of everything that happens in the universe. Another problem here is that God is already and has always been understood to be the sustainer of the cosmos. The idea that it's a problem if he has to sort of poke the universe to make it life-permitting is bizarre, because theists have always said that God sustains the universe. I suppose poke is supposed to sound worse than sustain, but to me they are basically the same thing. God is supposed to be the sustainer and kind of regenerator, maintainer of the universe. So if he wants to maintain it in a miraculous state of permitting the existence of complex life, despite the fundamental laws of physics not permitting that in that universe, then that's God's prerogative. What basis do we have to say that that's less likely than any other alternative? So in conclusion, we see that proponents of the fine-tuning argument exercise a consistent lack of imagination and double standards with respect to defending their key premise that it's relatively more likely that God would create a fine-tuned universe than that we would observe a fine-tuned universe under naturalistic laws by themselves. Let's see this argument summarized again, but with some additional graphics to help us out here. So the fine-tuning argument states that the probability of a life-permitting universe, given just the standard model equations, but we don't know what the constants will be, but we've set the equations as fixed, so we're holding those as I've said before, and just looking at imagining the constants were different. So the idea is the probability of a life-permitting universe under that circumstance is low, because on the top we have a dot representing the range of possible life-permitting universes. And then on the denominator here, we have 5 dots representing the much larger number of possible combinations of constants. So the life-permitting combinations being much smaller than the range of possible constants, at least as far as we know. The constants could be any of those values. And so overall, the probability of a life-permitting universe under an assumption of only the standard model equations is low. But the probability of a life-permitting set of constants under theism, so the argument goes, is much higher. Because, as you see, the denominator here is smaller, and the reason it's smaller is because the range of possible sets of constants that you would expect under theism is much smaller, because we, so the argument goes, have ruled out many sets of constants that God just wouldn't want to create. God would only want to create sets of constants that are life-permitting, and so the overall range of those is much, much smaller. Therefore, if we take the ratio of what are called the likelihoods here, the likelihood ratio of the probability of a life-permitting universe under theism, divided by the probability of a life-permitting universe given just the standard model equations, we see that the number of ways the universe could be under naturalism is much bigger than the number of ways the constants could be under theism, thereby providing strong evidence in favor of theism, that the probability of a life-permitting universe under theism is much higher than it is under naturalism, or just the standard model equations. So that's how the argument is supposed to go. However, the key problem here, and what I've been articulating throughout this video, is that likelihood ratios are easy to inflate if you pack all of the assumptions that you need to into your prior. So the point of that is we need to consider the assumptions we're making about God's nature or desires and how they influence the prior probability of the proposition that God created the universe, or a certain type of God created the universe. So let's see how that works. Let's see how this kind of prior packing works in giving the appearance of a strong argument for the existence of God without, in fact, actually doing so. To understand this, we're going to use Bayes' theorem and consider what we actually care about, which is not the likelihood ratio, but in fact, the posterior, the probability of theism conditional on a life-permitting set of constants. That's what we actually care about with the fine-tuning argument. It's supposed to be establishing that the probability of theism given a life-permitting set of constants is relatively high. So the probability of theism given life-permitting constants is equal to the probability of life-permitting constants conditional on theism, that's our likelihood term, times our prior probability of theism. Technically, there's a normalizing constant in there, but we're just going to forget about that. Now, let's start making some more assumptions in order to get this likelihood nice and high. So let's first assume that a benevolent God exists. So under this fairly small assumption, at least small for the sake of argument, we see that there is still a very low likelihood. The probability of a life-permitting universe given simply the existence of a benevolent God is low. Why? Well, because there's many, many ways that benevolent God could create the universe, many sets of constants that he might create, because we don't know very much about what a benevolent God might do. That's based on the arguments that I've been making previously. And then we multiply that by our prior. Now, our prior isn't too low in this case. It's because we're not making too many assumptions about the nature of God. We're just assuming that he's all-powerful and all good. So the probability there is not too low. We're not making too strong assumptions. Let's now make some more assumptions, because really what we want to do as the theist is to get this probability higher here. We want this likelihood to be higher, the probability of a life-permitting universe given theism. So let's make some extra assumptions about God and see what we can get away with here. Assume a benevolent God who wants to create life. So we're going to add an extra assumption to our prior about theism. And we notice what happens is that the likelihood goes up here. The reason it goes up is because we've removed some space for some of these terms here in the denominator by cutting out the number of ways that God might want to create the universe, the number of plausible ways that the God we've assumed would be interested in creating the universe, because now we've assumed that the God wants to create life. Before, we didn't make that assumption. So we've cut out a whole bunch of possible universes that God would create if he wasn't interested in creating life. But we've assumed that he does want to create life, and so those can be removed from the possibilities. And so we've reduced the number of possible universes that we have to consider God would have an interest in creating. So this has increased our likelihood. Now, the cost of that is that we've also decreased our prior. You see here that we've now made more assumptions, more specific demands on the nature of God, and so compared to the total range of ways that God could be, we're now considering a smaller slice of that. So the prior has to go down in proportion. Let's take this to the next step and now assume a benevolent God who wants to create embodied life specifically, not just any type of life, but specifically embodied life. And the pattern repeats. So now the probability of a life-permitting universe under theism is now looking quite high, because we've eliminated most of the different possible ways that God might want to create the universe, and so we're only down to a fairly narrow range of possible universes that God would want to create. And so the probability of life-permitting universe given that version of God is now relatively high. So we've got our likelihood up nice and high, just as we wanted. Notice the cost, though, that the pry has gone down even more, and that's because we've made a further assumption about the nature of God. Relative to all the ways God could theoretically be, we've made additional assumptions, and so the prior that we assign to that has to go down in proportion, or at least the prior should do, if we're using a consistent approach, as the theists say we should, with assessing the probability of life-permitting constants under naturalism, as I'll explain in a moment. So the lesson here is that what theists are effectively doing when they use the fine-tuning argument is they're inflating this likelihood here and claiming that that shows that there is strong evidence from the existence of life-permitting constants for theism, but in doing so, they're ignoring the fact that they have to make a whole bunch of assumptions about what God would want and have and desire and so forth. And in doing so, that makes the prior of the type of theism they're talking about very, very low. This is why I say they're stuffing all of the low probability into their prior and claiming victory because now their likelihood is very high. But the issue here is that it doesn't matter whether you move things from the likelihood to your prior. What matters is the posterior probability of the claim that you want to defend, which in this case is theism. And my claim is that the fine-tuning argument barely changes that, if at all, because it's just moving things from the likelihood to the prior by making more and more specific assumptions about the type of God you are claiming must exist. The point here is therefore that just as physicists find that the constants of nature are fine-tuned for the existence of embodied life, or at least our type of embodied life, apologists also have to fine-tune their idea of God so that we expect a God that would want to create embodied life in a universe with laws that permit the existence of that life, and so forth. We can illustrate that with a diagram here. On the left is one of the fine-tuning diagrams that I showed you earlier with two different physical parameters from the standard model, and on the right I'm using the same diagram, obviously for illustrative purposes, to show how if you're being consistent and apply the same standard to assessing the probability of a set of constants and a set of types of ways that God could be, then you should look at it in the same way. Well, there's a range of possibilities about what God might value and a range of possibilities about how God might go about achieving it. In fact, I think there are many other attributes and parameters that we could consider about God as well, not just these two, but this will do for illustrative purposes here. And the point is that only a very narrow range of possibilities about what God would value and how he would achieve it will be suitable for getting the right answer out, getting a God that would be expected to create a universe with embodied life in a way that respects the underlying, constants that give rise to that life. Fine-tuning is just as much of an issue in this case for the theists as it is for the naturalists. It's just that they're fine-tuning something different, which is the properties of God or desires of God, and they try to get away with it with a lot of hand-waving because whilst there's actually a procedure and rigor around how to assess the probabilities of different outcomes in physics, there is no such method or rigor or standards in the field of theology. You can wave your hands around and make vague generalizations about, embodied life is good because of agency or something, and expect that that's sufficient. Well, my argument here is that that is a double standard. If you actually apply the same method to assess the probability of fine-tuned constants as you do to fine-tuned God, then you'd see that, in fact, all the argument is doing is making more and more assumptions about God, and therefore making that prior probability very, very small. So let's summarize what I've talked about in this video. The fine-tuning argument states that the constants of nature are life-permitting, and that this fact is strong evidence for theism relative to naturalism, because it's expected under theism but not under naturalism. The first problem with this argument, as I've talked about, is that it involves fixating on the constants and ignoring the laws, equations of motion, and so forth in the standard model, and this is entirely arbitrary and unjustified. The second problem is that the argument involves a massive appeal to ignorance because we don't actually know what the conditions are for the existence of complex embodied life, and physicists are making massive extrapolations and leaps of logic when they assume that there can't be any other types of life that don't involve conditions similar to those we have in our universe. The third and biggest problem with the fine-tuning argument is that it assumes that we know what type of universe God would be likely to create. But the problem of divine psychology shows that we in fact don't know this unless we make a whole bunch of extra assumptions about what God would be likely to do. And theists do that, but use double standards and lack of imagination to obfuscate the issue. They pretend that, well, there's not that many ways God could do it, and just sort of wave their hands around, and they don't actually engage in the same standards of assessing how probable different outcomes are. and don't actually assess the probability of different types of God in the same way that they do assess the probability of different values of physical constants. So there's a double standard in that, and there's a lack of imagination in actually thinking about the vast number of ways that God could have created the universe or could have reason to create the universe, depending on what we assume about the nature of God. So in conclusion, in my view, the fine-tuning argument is a very weak argument. It provides little to no evidence for the existence of God. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you disagree, feel free to send a video or written response to my email, fods12@gmail.com. And if I think you have something interesting to say, you'd be welcome to come onto my channel and have a discussion. Otherwise, thanks everyone for listening. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Stick around and take care. Bye.